when love turns into structure, family conflict, emotional boundaries, and the space between. This lecture continues from our previous discussion, where we explored a difficult and often painful question. Why do some daughters-in-law completely cut off contact with their in-laws? In part 1, we examined an uncomfortable truth. Extreme withdrawal is rarely a simple personality flaw. It is not always arrogance, immaturity, or moral failure. Often, it is a survival response. When a person feels psychologically overwhelmed, cornered between expectations, loyalty conflicts, and perceived judgment, the nervous system shifts into protection mode. In contemplative traditions, this liminal psychological state is sometimes described as Bardo, a threshold state between stability and collapse. In modern psychological language, we might call it dysregulation under relational threat. Today we ask a harder question. Can this threshold be crossed? And if so, how? Not every relationship can be restored. That must be stated clearly. But among those that do recover, patterns emerge. And among those that do not, patterns emerge as well. Recovery is not produced by good intentions. It is not secured by love alone. It is not guaranteed by time. Recovery happens only when certain structural conditions are met. What makes restoration possible? When reconciliation is possible, 3 shifts tend to appear. First, the daughter-in-law no longer chooses total severance. Instead of absolute cutoff, she chooses conditional distance. This is not surrender. It is measured engagement with boundaries. Second, the husband stops translating emotions between sides. He communicates boundaries, not feelings. He does not explain his wife's fear to his parents. He does not justify his parents' disappointment to his wife. He delivers clarity, not emotional mediation. Third, the parents stop demanding to be understood. They shift from seeking validation to respecting structure. Notice something critical here. No one is asking to be understood, because this kind of conflict is not repaired through explanation. It is repaired through lived experience. Trust in these cases does not grow from arguments. It grows from repeated moments of non-intrusion. When restoration should not be the goal, there are also cases where pursuing reconciliation may cause more harm than healing. If the daughter-in-law shows persistent panic symptoms or dissociation, the system is overloaded. If the husband remains psychologically fused in a parent-child role with his parents, individuation has not occurred. If the parents perceive reconciliation as a restoration of honor rather than stabilization of structure, the motivation itself is destabilizing. In these situations, distance is not failure. Distance is containment. Western family systems theory calls this differentiation. Sometimes the most mature move in a system is not reconnection, but regulated separation. The 4 conditions required to cross the threshold. For a relational Bardo to resolve, 4 conditions must exist. 1. Distant without coercion. Distant without coercion. 1. 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 2. Redefinition of roles. 3. Capacity to endure silence. 4. Absence of demand for immediate emotional resolution. Without these, even kindness reactivates fear. This is counterintuitive for many parents, because parents often believe that doing something is better than doing nothing. But here is the paradox. Relationships do not recover because they are pulled closer. They recover because they are allowed space to breathe. Waiting is not passivity. Waiting is structural discipline. What must parents stop doing? Parents must first stop explaining. We didn't mean it that way. You misunderstood. We only wanted to help. Logically, these statements may be true. Psychologically, they are destabilizing because the person in defensive withdrawal does not hear clarification. She hears invalidation. Explanation in a dysregulated system is experienced as correction. Correction is experienced as threat. Second, parents must stop using the son as an emotional courier. Statements like, "She's being unfair," "We're hurt," "Doesn't she understand?" These do not relieve tension. They solidify triangulation. In family systems theory, triangulation stabilizes anxiety temporarily, but freezes development. The son becomes an emotional processor. The wife retreats further. The parents feel increasingly excluded. Third, parents must abandon the belief that time alone will solve this. Unspoken expectation is still pressure, and pressure, even when invisible, is perceptible. Expectation tightens the air in a room. What should parents do instead? They must step back from the parental role, not abandon love, but relinquish authority. No unsolicited advice, no moral evaluation, presence without intervention. In ecological terms, they become background rather than force. Communication becomes minimal and clean. One sentence, no emotional weight, no hidden expectation. For example, thinking of you, not "We're worried and hope you'll visit soon." In moments of psychological threshold, excessive language increases confusion. Silence, when disciplined, stabilizes the nervous system. Silence is not relational abandonment. Silence is oxygen. Now we turn to the son. Ironically, the most exhausted person in this structure is often not the daughter-in-law or the parents, but the son. He says, "I'll handle it. I'll mediate. I'll balance both sides." But mediation inside a family system rarely resolves conflict. It delays it. The mediator attempts to regulate everyone's feelings. He comforts his parents. He reassures his wife. He tries to be understood by both. Eventually, he becomes an emotional shock absorber, a shield. And a shield does not stand, it absorbs impact. Over time, he collapses in one of two directions: explosive resentment toward his parents, or numb resignation toward his wife. Neither produces stability. What must the son do? First, he must refuse responsibility for his parents' emotional processing. When they say, "What did we do wrong?" or "Are you not on our side?" he must not argue. He must not persuade. He must not soothe. He can say, "This is not about sides. I am not choosing between you." This is not coldness. It is boundary clarity. Second, he must stop trying to eliminate his wife's fear. Many husbands say, "Don't worry, I'll protect you," or "I'll explain everything." But fear does not dissolve through explanation. His role is not to absorb her anxiety. It is to allow her to experience it without rescuing her from it. When he says, "I understand you're anxious. I cannot fix that for you," he creates differentiation. Differentiation feels lonely. It feels uncomfortable, but it is the only position that shifts the structure, the adult position. The son is not primarily a child anymore, nor is he primarily a protector. He must stand as an independent adult. This is the most destabilizing move in the short term and the only stabilizing move in the long term. When he drops the shield, two things happen. The daughter-in-law is forced to confront her fear directly. The parents are forced to confront their expectations directly. The system reorganizes. Final thought. A relationship in threshold does not respond to force. It responds to space. It does not respond to urgency. It responds to restraint. Silence is not surrender. Distance is not defeat. Waiting is not neglect. They are structural recalibration. And sometimes the most loving act in a family system is not stepping forward, but stepping back and allowing the heir to return to the room. When survival becomes identity, what the daughter-in-law must confront after distance. In the previous lecture, we ended with a decisive shift. The husband must step out of the shield position and stand as an independent adult, not as a mediator, not as a protector, not as a loyal son torn in half, but as a differentiated individual who can tolerate discomfort without collapsing the system. When that happens, something changes in the emotional geometry of the family. And now we arrive at the next essential question. If the parents must step back and the husband must stand upright, then what must the daughter-in-law learn? This is where the conversation becomes more difficult, because understanding someone's withdrawal is not the same as excusing it. Distance can be justified. Permanent emotional exile cannot. Distance is survival, but it is not maturity. Let us be clear. Cutting off contact may be the correct choice at a particular moment. When someone feels psychologically cornered, misunderstood, overruled, intruded upon, distance can be the only available act of self-preservation. But when distance hardens into identity, something else happens. What began as protection becomes a lifestyle. What began as stabilization becomes avoidance. Distance must function as a temporary wall, not a permanent architecture. Otherwise, the individual does not merely lose a relationship, she loses the opportunity for growth. And here is the first task she must confront. I am not afraid of this person. I am afraid of what this interaction awakens in me. Until that distinction is made, every present conflict becomes a replay of the past. In trauma psychology, we call this emotional time collapse the nervous system, responding to yesterday as though it is happening today. Maturity begins the moment fear is recognized as an internal activation rather than an external enemy. Control softens when awareness deepens. The strength that became armor. Many women who choose extreme cutoff describe themselves this way. I'm just sensitive. I'm not good at relationships. This is often inaccurate. More frequently, these are individuals who were forced into emotional adulthood too early. They learned self-reliance before they learned safe dependence. The problem is not weakness. The problem is armor that never comes off. Distance becomes the only reliable strategy, because vulnerability feels unsafe. But if armor becomes permanent, intimacy becomes impossible. The responsibility that follows cutoff. If distance is chosen, it carries responsibility, not toward the in-laws first, but toward oneself. 3 things must not happen. 1. Fear must not be outsourced to the husband. 2. Silence must not become a weapon. All anxiety must not be projected outward as someone else's fault. Cutoff is the beginning of healing, not its conclusion. No one can cross a psychological threshold on your behalf. You feel your fear alone. You make your choices alone. You grow alone. If this stage is bypassed, the pattern simply relocates. The next friendship, the next workplace, the next generation. Avoidance reproduces itself unless confronted internally. What mature boundaries look like. So, what does growth look like? It does not mean enduring mistreatment. It means developing language. 1. Feeling anxiety without immediately resorting to severance. 2. Setting boundaries without over-explaining. 3. Recognizing that you are not responsible for fulfilling every expectation, but also recognizing that you are responsible for how you show up. When these capacities develop, distance becomes a tool, not an identity, and something else begins to move. The family system, previously frozen, begins to reorganize. Why is this happening so often now? At this point, a broader question emerges. Why does this pattern seem increasingly common? Why does cutoff appear more frequently in modern families than in previous generations? This is not merely individual pathology. It is a systemic phenomenon in therapy offices, in online communities, in legal disputes, even in public policy conversations. The pattern appears simultaneously. That tells us something. This is structural. Modern society dismantled extended family. hierarchies but left expectations intact. Authority was softened, roles were blurred, but emotional obligations remained. We now live in an unstable transitional model, not traditional enough to provide structure, not modern enough to provide contractual clarity. In older societies, marriage came with defined distance, communal guidance, and conflict buffers. There were mediating layers. Today, those buffers are gone. The daughter-in-law often faces the threshold alone. Without guidance, the most efficient survival strategy wins. That strategy is often silence or severance. Why does it concentrate on the daughter-in-law? Because she occupies the most asymmetrical position. High expectation, low authority, full accountability. She is expected to integrate into a system she did not design. Given responsibility without corresponding power. Judged quickly for failure. Cutoff becomes an unconscious protest against structural imbalance. When we dismiss this as a generational problem, we misdiagnose the system. Blame personalizes what is structural, and structures do not change through accusation. The core thesis: family systems do not sustain themselves automatically. If they are not intentionally designed, they destabilize. Parents must take responsibility for speaking from the correct position, not from intrusion. Husbands must manage boundaries, not mediate emotions. Daughters-in-law must cultivate language, not default to disappearance. If even one of these collapses, the family cannot move through its threshold state. Cutoff is not the cause. It is the last visible symptom. When communication fails, when boundaries are ignored, when mediation collapses, the final act of self-protection is erasure. Blocked numbers, unshared addresses, complete silence. This is not aggression. It is exhaustion. The unanswered question. And yet one question remains. Did this structure appear suddenly, or was the groundwork laid much earlier in developmental stages, where fear first fused with intimacy? If we do not investigate that earlier threshold, we will keep treating outcomes instead of origins. Because extreme cutoff in adulthood rarely begins in adulthood. It often forms in adolescence, a psychological threshold where attachment, identity, and autonomy collide. In our next lecture, we will examine how unresolved developmental ruptures, particularly parental divorce and early attachment, disruptions can crystallize into adult relational withdrawal. Why does one child integrate a rupture and move forward, while another carries it into every future bond? Where does the divergence occur? Until we answer that, we will keep misinterpreting distance as defiance, and we will continue mistaking survival strategies for character flaws. This conversation continues in Part 3.